Today I'm going to demonstrate how to make a friendship star quilt block out of fabric as opposed to when we did it out of paper in our class. The first thing I'm going to do is make a 9-inch square. I treat each of these squares on the grid as 1 inch, so I just need to do 9 by 9. And I drew a couple too many squares, so normally I would do this out of pencil. However, it's easier to see the pen. Then you're going to break up your block into 9 equal squares. This is called a 9-patch quilt block. Now we need to make the design portion. So I'm going to draw some diagonal lines, creating what quilters call half square triangles. No, they're not perfect, but that's okay for the purposes of drawing the pattern. And add some color. The color is really just to make it easier when you are writing your pattern. It's a lot easier to say for purple triangles as opposed to 4 white triangles and 4 other triangles. It just makes it more specific. The main difference between doing a quilt block and a paper block is that your quilt block needs what's called seam allowances. When we quilt, we usually use what's called a 1/4 inch seam. So whenever you're figuring out your measurements, you have to add a 1/4 inch to each side. So for our 3-inch block, finished size, it needs to be 3.5 by 3.5. So let's figure out what we need. We're going to break this problem down. It looks like I need 1, 2, 3, 4 white squares, and 1 purple square, and they're all measuring 3.5 by 3.5. Now I need to figure out my triangles. Remember, we need to take into account seam allowance. So if these are going to end up being 3.5 inches, we're actually going to add an additional inch. Or not inch, we're going to add an additional 1/2 inch. So I need 2 squares that are white, two squares that are purple, and these need to measure 4 inches by 4 inches. And what we're going to do with those squares is we are going to cut them on the diagonal. So I've already gone ahead and cut all my fabric out. So here are my squares and here are my triangles. The first thing we need to do is sew our triangles together. This one's not as flat as I like, so I'm just going to give it a quick press. And now it's flat. I'm going to line those corners up. And we're going to go ahead and sometimes my sewing machine eats fabric, so I need to let it sew for a little bit before I put a triangle in. I'm going to go ahead and insert my triangle, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch from that diagonal line. And I'm going to do that 4 times. If something's a little crinkly, I'm just going to give it a quick press. Once you have all of your triangles sewn together, you're going to give them a quick press just to set the seams. And then I like to open my seams. So again, we're just helping them to lay flat. Excuse me. So sometimes I'll give them a quick finger press, and then I'll use my little iron to keep it nice and open. Next thing you'll want to do is trim off these little triangles, because you just don't need them. These are sometimes affectionately called dog ears. So you can just cut all those off. Whenever you're making half square triangles, you have to remember that you probably are going to need to do some trimming afterwards. We usually cut them a little bit big and then trim them down to size. So now you have 4 3.5 inch squares. The next step is going to be to lay out our quilt block. So remember, we're doing this 3x3 layout with 9 squares. So let's do that. All right, your final step is going to be to sew this block together. So let's do that. We always work in pairs, so we're going to line up our half square triangle with our background fabric. And again, we're using that 1/4 inch seam. Oops, thread didn't cut. So now we've sewn our first seam. Now I'm going to add the second background fabric here. And we've got our first quilt block row. We're going to do that for the next 2 rows, making sure to keep our fabrics in order so that our star ends up correct. It's really easy to turn pieces around, especially when you're working with those half square triangles. One of the most important parts of quilting is ironing your seams. So I'm going to press my seams so they go in opposite directions for the rows. So for this row, all my seams are going to go that way. And for this row, all my seams are going to go this way. And then for this one, just like the first row we did, we're going to go in that direction. The reason for this is because it makes it really easy to match your seams. Do you see how those seams kind of kiss together right there? It's because you ironed them in opposite directions. So let's sew them together. Many people at this stage would pin. You can, but you don't have to. I've never been much for pinning. Cut those threads. Grab the last row. Line up those seams like we did before. See how they kiss together oh so nicely. And then we're going to sew. Just going to pause and readjust to make sure that my seams are lined up well. And then I'm going to put You may be thinking to yourselves, ah, we're done, because there's our quilt block, but really we're not. There's one final step. We have to iron it. We're going to get it nice and flat. And that is how you make a friendship star quilt block. See the resemblance?